Welcome back to Dreamtime Discoveries. Tonight, we turn not to the skies, but to the depths. The oceans. Are they only water? Or could they be home to something stranger? What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is part of the Unknown series, where we explore mysteries without easy answers. From the skies above to the waters below. Before we start, if these secrets of the deep keep you curious, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the next encounter. Let's begin beneath the surface. USO overview. Most of our planet is water, and most of that water hides a darkness no human eye has seen. We've mapped Mars more thoroughly than the ocean floor. Yet, for more than a century, those who work the seas and skies have reported the same thing. Objects moving beneath the waves with a speed and precision no known craft should possess. These reports are not rare. They appear in ships' journals, radar logs, and official records, sometimes buried for years before surfacing. And among those who've witnessed them, one term is spoken quietly: USOs. Unidentified submerged objects. Unlike UFOs, these are not lights in distant skies. They are craft, or something like craft, operating in an environment that should make such movement impossible. At depths where pressure crushes steel, they maneuver as if unchallenged. They accelerate faster than submarines. Turn without slowing. And sometimes rise from the deep to slip seamlessly into the air. Some are silent, known only by sudden breaks in sonar. Others glow with pale light, visible for miles across black water. Whatever they are, they do not behave like human technology. And this is not a modern mystery. From early naval logs of the 20th century to Cold War patrols and encounters, declassified only in recent years, the pattern remains. Our oceans may be hiding something we still do not understand. These aren't rumors. They're events that forced navies to act. One of the first came more than a century ago, when a steamship off Africa reported something no one could explain. Historical cases for it. Salisbury Lights, 1902. Atlantic. In the early hours of September 1902, the British steamship Fort Salisbury was making her way across the Atlantic. Off the coast of West Africa. The voyage had been calm. The air was heavy but still. The seas low and uneventful. The kind of night officers welcomed. Steady progress with no surprises. On the bridge, an officer stood watch. Far forward on the bow, a lookout scanned the dark horizon. The watch was routine. The kind of slow, silent stretch where minutes seemed to drag. It was just after 3 o'clock in the morning when the first sign of trouble appeared. The lookout's voice cut the quiet. 2 steady lights were ahead, low on the water. The officer lifted his glass. The lights were not stars. They were not the scattered flicker of lanterns from another vessel. They seemed fixed, holding their distance, unwavering. They were set apart like the beam of a great ship. But something was wrong. There was no silhouette of masts or smokestacks. No sound of engines carried over the water. Nothing but the faint wash of the sea could be heard. No movement broke the horizon except the slow natural heave of the ocean itself. The officer studied the sight. The lights remained steady. Their placement suggested something structured. Deliberate. And yet no vessel should have been there. Not at that hour. Not without sound or form. As the Fort Salisbury drew closer, a vast bulk seemed to rise out of the night. Witnesses later described it as darker than the sea itself. A shape too broad and heavy to be mistaken for driftwood or wreckage. The impression was immediate. Something immense was lying ahead, and it occupied the ship's path. Details began to take shape. Some of the men spoke of faint ridges across its back, as though the surface was not smooth, but patterned. Others recalled lines that suggested scales. an uneven texture across the mass. A few even thought they saw what looked like fins along its sides. To others, these impressions blurred into one simple conclusion. It was immense. A black body stretched across the water, silent and still. For a moment, the officers on watch thought collision was certain. The mass loomed larger as the ship pressed forward. The steady lights continued to shine, low and unbroken, casting no reflection and offering no explanation. The bridge braced for impact. The order to stand by was given. Then, without warning, the bulk began to sink. It did not thrash like a whale. It did not roll like a great fish or dive like a pod of dolphins breaking water. Its descent was different, measured, steady. As though carried out by intent. It slid beneath the surface with deliberate slowness. The kind of motion that suggested control rather than instinct. The two lights moved down with it. For a brief moment, they glowed faintly beneath the waves, holding their fixed distance even as they sank. One after the other, they faded. And then they were gone. In moments, the ocean was dark again. The horizon was empty. The sea lay calm as if nothing had disturbed it. The men on watch waited, their eyes fixed on the black water. They expected some return. A rise, a ripple, any sign of movement. But nothing followed. The surface remained unbroken. The massive form, whatever it had been, did not return. The Fort Salisbury continued forward, her engines steady, her course unchanged. Yet the memory of what had passed hung heavy on the crew. They had seen something vast. They had seen it sink. And now it was gone. When calm returned to the bridge, the officer on duty entered the incident into the ship's log. His words were chosen carefully. The account was not embellished. It did not speculate. It did not reach for explanation. It noted only the essentials. The two fixed lights seen ahead, the vast bulk that appeared to block the ship's course, the impression of ridges or fins, and the slow, deliberate descent beneath the waves. Later, when the story began to circulate beyond the ship, the captain himself vouched for the honesty of his men. He affirmed that the officers had written what they believed they saw. No exaggeration had been made. No invention had been added. The log reflected the event as it had been witnessed, plain and unadorned. Still, the encounter left questions that no one could answer. A living creature seemed unlikely. No whale carried paired lights that shone steadily, and no fish was known to hold formation with a glow so fixed and unwavering. The idea of some deep-sea animal failed to explain the symmetrical lamps, or the immense shape that moved with such quiet control. Yet a ship seemed just as impossible. In 1902, submarines existed only in primitive forms. Small experimental craft still limited in design and ability. No navy anywhere in the world possessed a machine vast enough to match the scale described that night, and none could have slipped silently beneath the surface with such ease, vanishing without leaving behind a trace of wake or sound. The Fort Salisbury pressed onward with her voyage. The sea closed behind her, calm and uneventful once more. But for the men on duty that night, the moment lingered. Two steady lights on the surface of the Atlantic. A black structure broad enough to span the beam of a steamship. The slow, deliberate descent into black water, and then only emptiness. The logbook still carries their words. Plain, unadorned. Their entry stands as though even the officers themselves struggled to find language equal to what they had seen. They could only write what was before their eyes. The lights, the shape, the descent. The disappearance. What passed beneath the Fort Salisbury that September night was never explained. And more than a century later, the account stands as it did then. A calm record of something vast and unaccountable moving in the ocean where no known vessel should have been. Years on, Beneath the ice with cameras and sonar, another crew would record something just as hard to explain. Eltonin seafloor photograph, 1964. Chile. In 1964, the United States Navy ship Eltonin carried out scientific missions far from land. Converted from freighter to research vessel, she was equipped with instruments designed to probe the deep ocean. She carried sonar arrays, magnetometers, and cameras that could be lowered thousands of meters into the dark. On August 29, 1964, the vessel was operating off the coast of Chile. The assignment given that day was simple in outline, but immense in scale. The crew was to lower photographic equipment to a depth of more than 2,500 meters and capture images of the sea floor dot. The work unfolded step by step. Heavy cables were unspooled from the deck, disappearing steadily into the water. The cameras sank slowly into the cold black depths, vanishing from sight as they descended through crushing pressure and endless dark. Hours later, the equipment was retrieved. The reels of film were carried below deck for development ... as they had been many times before on similar missions. Most of the frames held nothing unexpected. They showed sediment lying in thick blankets across the seafloor. They showed scattered rocks ... jagged and irregular. They revealed the shadows of strange creatures adapted to a world with no light. It was exactly what the crew had grown used to recording, but among those familiar frames was one that did not fit. The photograph revealed a structure rising upright from the seabed. It was vertical, not slumped or scattered, but standing straight as though anchored in place. Near the top, it branched outward. The shape was unusually symmetrical. A central stem rose cleanly, and from it extended crosspieces that radiated outward at even angles. The outline called to mind not a natural form, but something built, like the mast of a device, deliberately set into the ocean floor. In stark black and white, it carried the look not of accident, not of drift, but of design. The picture was examined closely aboard ship. Those who saw it agreed that it was unlike the scattered coral shapes or sponge forms normally caught on film. This was different. The structure was clear ... upright ... and solitary in its setting. Its form seemed too precise, too deliberate. It gave the impression that it had been placed there, as though something had been planted in the darkness ... waiting. The frame did not remain aboard the vessel. It was passed ashore, then copied and circulated. Eventually, it appeared in newspapers, where it was labeled simply as the Eltonin antenna. Readers who saw the strange image stared at its curious form. Against the barren seafloor, the shape looked less like biology and more like technology. The story spread, and with it, the photograph spread too. It became one of the rare times when the mystery of the ocean was captured so directly on film. For the crew of the Eltonin, it was logged and filed like any other sample. To them, it was one image among thousands collected over the course of their work. But for those who examined it later, the picture carried weight. Unlike a fleeting eyewitness account which lived only in memory, the Eltonin photograph was physical. It was a strip of film. It showed something that had stood on the seabed, 2.5 kilometers down, in a place where no known structure should have been. The photograph raised questions that lingered long after the voyage had ended. What was it that stood on the ocean floor? How could something of such symmetry exist in that crushing environment? And why did it appear so stark, so solitary ... so distinct from everything around it? The questions never found firm answers. Decades passed, yet the image retained its grip. It was reprinted in books. It was reproduced in journals. It appeared in reports ... always with the same unmistakable outline. The mast-like stem, the evenly spaced crossbars, The suggestion of something that had been placed, not grown. Its mystery never faded because no duplicate of the structure was ever located. No certain identification was ever given. In the history of unexplained photographs, the Eltonin image stands apart. It was not rumor. It was not imagination. It was the product of equipment lowered into the abyss, recording without bias or intent. The black and white frame spoke on its own, silent and unadorned. Even now, 6 decades later, the photograph endures. It is studied. It is debated. It is shared again and again. Always it carries with it the same sense of unease. The deep ocean guards its secrets well. And in 1964, for one brief moment, it seemed to reveal the outline of one. The Eltonin continued her mission, mapping and surveying the Pacific, her crew moving on to the next task. But the photograph remained. It has endured as one of the sea's most persistent mysteries. A single image of something standing where no known structure should exist. Stark, unexplained, and still waiting for an answer. Soon after, the instruments picked up something stranger still. Not an outline, but the trace of motion itself. Antarctic deep freeze sonar, 1968. In the late 1960s, the United States was expanding its presence in one of the harshest regions on Earth, Antarctica. The effort was called Operation Deep Freeze. A series of missions supporting scientific research and U.S. Navy logistics in the frozen South. At its core, Deep Freeze was about supply runs, construction, and supporting research stations. But it also relied on modern naval equipment, ships fitted with sonar, radar, and instruments to map the sea beneath the ice. It was during one of these missions in 1968 that something unusual occurred. Unlike stories based only on memory, this one began with machines. Sonar systems built to record what lay below. What they detected was something that should not have been there. Antarctic waters were unforgiving. Ships moved slowly among drifting ice, their hulls straining against the cold. Even vessels built for endurance faced constant risks. Sudden flows, hidden ridges, and unpredictable storms. That year, one ship, accounts differ on whether it was the icebreaker Glacier or one of her support vessels, was assigned to chart a stretch of seabed. Sonar sweeps were run at regular intervals, building up a picture of the terrain below. Most of the time, the results were predictable. Slopes, trenches, and jagged rises, all blurred in the grainy texture of sonar printouts. But on one of those passes, the return was different. The sonar screen showed a contact of enormous size. Operators at the console watched as the return lit up larger and clearer than anything they were used to. It was not an iceberg. Ice showed a broken pattern, often jagged and uneven. This was different. Solid, broad, and strangely symmetrical. The shape seemed to rise from the seafloor at a depth of more than 2,000 meters. At first, some thought it must be a false return, a quirk of the system. But the signal repeated. Each ping came back the same. A vast object standing where the seabed should have been empty. Some who saw the readings later described them as resembling an artificial structure. Its edges too even, its shape too regular. Others thought of a sunken ship, but the scale was far larger than any vessel ever built. The contact stretched across hundreds of meters with outlines that looked out of place against natural seabed. The operators marked the readings, and the ship's officers were called in. For long minutes, the crew stared at the echo, holding steady on the screen. Its outline did not move. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The next sweep came back clean. The seabed was blank again. Dark, cold, featureless dot. The disappearance made little sense. Nothing that size could simply vanish. Icebergs drift, but not at that depth. A geological rise could not move. Yet the echo was gone. Some suggested a fault in the machine, but the operators noted that the system had worked normally before and after the anomaly. Others speculated about a swarm of sea life, but the readings were too sharp, too solid. Biological returns were scattered, never this uniform. This had been an object in the sonar room. The men kept their voices low. Some thought they had discovered a hidden seamount, a rise missed in earlier surveys. Others were less sure, wondering if it could have been a wreck, or even something still alive. No agreement was reached, but the unease lingered. The ship's log had to reflect the event. Regulations demanded the record remain plain. Without speculation, the officer in charge entered the incident as an unidentified sonar contact of unusual magnitude, observed at depth persistent for several sweeps, then gone. No theories, no guesses, just the bare facts. But among the men, the memory was not so plain. That night, in the mess, talk circled back to the anomaly. Some admitted they had felt uneasy watching the shape hold steady, dominating the screen. Others said its disappearance was worse than its appearance, as if something had pulled back deliberately into the dark. When the ship returned to port, the sonar logs and tapes were sent with the rest of the mission's data. Like much of Operation Deep Freeze, the material went into Navy archives where it remained. But the men who were there did not forget in later years. When recalling their time on Antarctic duty, they mentioned storms ice, and long nights. And always, if the question of strange events arose, they returned to the sonar anomaly of 1968. They remembered the moment when the instruments had shown them something massive, a shape that should not have been there. And they remembered just as clearly the moment it was gone, leaving only silence. The Antarctic night closed in again. The ship moved on with its course, and the strange return that had filled the sonar screen was left behind. Unresolved and unexplained. Norwegian Fjord Hunt, 1972, in nearer waters. What had been marks on a chart emerged as an unfolding operation in a Norwegian fjord. The first to notice were the fishermen. Nets that had been cast in the usual way came back torn, or else pulled with a force that seemed greater than anything they had experienced before. On more than one occasion, boats were jolted from below the sudden impact strong enough to shake men standing on deck. Ripples moved across still water without any obvious source, spreading in straight lines that suggested movement below. Soon, others began to mention something stranger. Hunters traveling in small boats reported feeling deep vibrations running through their hulls. The sound was not like the calls of whales or porpoises, noises they knew well. Instead, it was steady low and deliberate, a pulse that seemed to come from far beneath them. The vibrations were felt as much as they were heard, a slow thrum that passed through wood and water alike. Word of these events spread quickly through the nearby villages. Fishermen shared what they had experienced, and hunters added their own accounts. The stories differed in detail, but the theme was the same. The fjord seemed to contain something large and unknown. It was enough to draw serious attention. At first, the response came from hunters who launched their skiffs with rifles and harpoons. They searched the fjord as though tracking a large animal, circling the areas where disturbances had been reported. Nets were cast again and again in hopes of trapping whatever was moving beneath the surface. As the reports multiplied, more boats joined in. Fishing vessels that usually worked the waters for their catch now devoted their time to searching. The scale of the effort increased, and soon it was more than a local hunt. Eventually, the Norwegian Navy dispatched ships to assist. By midsummer, the fjord had become unusually crowded. Small boats moved between larger vessels, running search patterns, and watching the surface for the slightest sign. Lights swept the water after dark, and men waited with rifles at the ready. The fjord, normally a quiet place broken only by the sound of oars or nets being hauled, became the setting for a full-scale pursuit. Reports from the search accumulated, but offered no clear conclusion. Nets came back torn again and again, sometimes shredded as if cut through by force from below. Ripples appeared on open water where no vessel was present, spreading out into waves before fading back to calm. On at least one occasion, hunters claimed to see a dark, massive shape rolling just beneath the surface. It was smooth, broad, and unlike the movements of whales or fish known in the region, the impression was of something large and heavy, moving with steady purpose. What struck many was how the disturbance seemed to respond to pursuit. Boats that tried to close the distance found the ripples shifting further away, always just out of reach. When engines were cut in an attempt to drift silently, the fjord would go still. Then, once the men had begun to relax, the water would break again at another point, bubbles rising and wakes forming, as if the presence had moved deliberately. The Navy brought equipment into the search, deploying sonar to track what the eye could not. The steep rock walls of the fjord made returns difficult to read, scattering signals and confusing the operators. Even so, several sonar men reported detecting a large, steady contact. It appeared solid, moved in a way that suggested control, and held its shape longer than a school of fish could. Yet each time the ships tried to fix on it, the contact vanished. Attempts to corner or contain the disturbance all failed. Nets were strung across the fjord, only to come back in tatters. Boats lined up to block possible routes, but wakes appeared elsewhere, as if the object had slipped past unseen. Gunfire was directed into the water more than once. Harpoons were thrown, yet no mark was ever made, and no trace was ever found. The pursuit stretched on for weeks. Through late summer, men scanned the fjord for signs. But in time, fuel was spent. Nets were ruined, and patience grew thin. Gradually, the hunt was abandoned. The Navy pulled back its ships. Fishermen and hunters returned to their normal work. By the arrival of autumn, the fjord was quiet again. The waters lay still. The disturbances gone. Nothing more was seen. No wreck was recovered. No animal was caught. No material evidence surfaced to prove what had moved in the fjord that summer. What remained were the memories and accounts of those who had taken part. Fishermen spoke of nets pulled with a strength beyond their experience. Hunters repeated their descriptions of a smooth, dark bulk just below the surface. Navy sonar operators recalled contacts too large to dismiss, yet impossible to pin down. Explanations differed. Some were certain it had been a living creature, unknown to science. Others argued for the possibility of a submarine trespassing in Norwegian waters, though no government ever confirmed such a presence. In the end, no official answer was given. The event was left unresolved. The fjord returned to its usual rhythm: boats fishing, hunters traveling, and the water calm once more. But for those who had been there, the summer of 1972 stood apart. They remembered the weeks when something vast and unaccounted for had moved beneath the surface. Present, pursued, and never caught. Civilian encounters outside the military. The same patterns showed up in quieter places, on riverbanks, fishing grounds, and open seas, where the only witnesses were those who make their living on the water. Pascagoula River Abduction, 1973, USA. On the evening of October 11, 1973, 2 men set out to fish along the banks of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. Charles Hickson, 42, worked at a shipyard. Calvin Parker, 19, was a welder who had only recently joined the job. That night, they brought their rods and a cooler. planning for a quiet few hours by the water. The sun had already dropped. The light was fading. Across the river, marsh grass and trees stood in shadow. The men sat near an abandoned shipyard site, casting lines, speaking little Dot. It was then that Parker noticed a glow moving across the water. At first, he thought it might be a boat with lights ... But the shape was not right. Hickson looked up. A bright oval object was descending ... silent, until it came to rest a short distance above the ground. The men later described it as about 30 feet across ... metallic ... and lit from within. A blue light washed over them. Before either could move, a hatch opened. From inside came 3 figures. They did not walk so much as glide. Hickson recalled their movement as smooth ... deliberate. Without the sway of steps, the figures were not like any people he had seen. Each stood about 5 feet tall with gray, wrinkled skin and long arms. Their heads were featureless except for a single slit where a mouth might be. At the ends of their arms were claw-like appendages. The men tried to run, but the blue light held them. Parker froze. Hickson felt himself lifted from the ground. 2 of the figures seized him under the arms and carried him toward the craft. Parker, though resisting, was also taken. Inside, Hickson later said he was brought into a bright room. A device like a large eye moved about his body, ... scanning. He could not move, though he remained fully aware. The figures made no sound. Parker, in his own account, described a similar experience. Being examined by something that circled his head, then losing sense of time until he was set back outside. When the men found themselves again on the riverbank, the craft was still there. The figures released them, glided back inside, and the object rose. It moved silently upward and vanished into the night. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Hickson was shaken, but collected enough to suggest they report what had happened. Parker was nearly overcome ... trembling, and wanted only to go home. Yet Hickson insisted. They drove directly to the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. There, they told their story to Sheriff Fred Diamond and Captain Glenn Ryder. At first, the deputies doubted what they were hearing, but they listened as the men repeated their account ... to test their truthfulness. Officers left the pair alone in a room with a hidden recorder. They expected to hear them collude, perhaps fabricate details. Instead, the recording caught only fear. Hickson tried to calm Parker, who said repeatedly he wished he could forget what had happened. Neither spoke as though inventing a tale. The sheriff's office notified other authorities. Within hours, the Coast Guard was made aware since the location was on navigable waters. Officers from nearby bases interviewed the men. Reports were taken, and both Hickson and Parker gave sworn statements. News of the event spread quickly, but the official concern in the first days was practical, whether something had intruded in controlled airspace or waterways. The Coast Guard sent patrol craft up the Pascagoula River and into adjacent bays, checking for unusual traffic. Nothing was found. In the following days, Hickson and Parker underwent medical checks. Hickson allowed himself to be questioned under hypnosis. Repeating the same account of being taken and examined. Parker avoided further sessions, saying the memory was too much for him. The case file at the sheriff's office grew with statements, sketches, and the secret recording. The Coast Guard added its own patrol logs, noting negative results in sweeps of the river. Together, the documents formed one of the most detailed sets of testimony in any civilian encounter up to that time. Weeks later, when asked again, Hickson maintained his account word for word. Parker, though reluctant, confirmed the same sequence. Both said they had no desire for publicity. Hickson explained that his only reason for going to the authorities was the seriousness of what they had seen and endured. No physical trace was ever found on the riverbank. The ground bore no marks of landing. The water carried no unusual residue. The only record remained in the testimony of the men, and the official reports filed after that October night. Years later, copies of the sheriff's tape surfaced, still carrying the raw voices of the two fishermen. Steady in Hickson's case, nearly breaking in Parker's. The Coast Guard logs also remained, listing patrols in the Pascagoula Channel, each ending the same way. No contact. What happened on the banks of the Pascagoula River was never resolved. Two men went out to fish. Both returned shaken. Insistent that they had been taken aboard a craft unlike anything on Earth. Their words were recorded immediately. Their fear preserved on tape. And their story followed by police and Coast Guard alike. The waters of the river closed again to their usual traffic. Fishing boats, barges, small craft moving under the bridges. But in the files of Jackson County and the U.S. Coast Guard, the October 1973 encounter remained, logged and preserved. A civilian report that pulled law enforcement and military attention into its wake. Far from the Gulf, another inland sea would produce a story stranger than most. Lake Baikal beings, 1980s. Siberia Lake Baikal in southern Siberia is the deepest freshwater lake on Earth. More than a mile deep in places, its waters are cold, clear, and vast. By the early 1980s, Soviet naval units trained there regularly, using the lake to test diving equipment, endurance, and under-ice operations. One exercise produced reports unlike anything else in the files. During a routine training dive, several divers descended into Baikal's depths. They were equipped with standard suits, tanks, and communications. Conditions were normal at first. Dim light from above, columns of bubbles, and the rocky slopes dropping into darkness. Then the routine broke. The men reported seeing shapes moving in the water around them. At first, they assumed it was another dive team. But as the figures drew closer, the details came into focus. They described large humanoid forms, nearly 3 meters tall, moving easily in the dense water. No visible oxygen tanks, no standard diving gear. Instead, the beings appeared to wear pale, tight-fitting coverings and rounded helmets that hid clear features. At least 3 of these figures were seen. They did not rush the divers or retreat. Instead, they hovered at a distance. Moving slowly, as if comfortable at the depth, the divers attempted to approach. Orders were given to capture one using nets. That attempt ended the encounter. The figures accelerated away without visible propulsion, covering distance faster than any human could underwater. Soviet divers gave chase. Exceeding their safety limits. Several made uncontrolled ascents. 3 developed severe decompression sickness. Emergency treatment was attempted, but not all survived. The incident was logged officially as a training accident. Those who had been present spoke differently. They recalled the sighting of humanoid forms just before the accident. In internal accounts, the surviving divers described the beings' movements in detail. One compared them to walking through air. Unhurried, yet impossibly fast when threatened. Another recalled how their pale coverings seemed almost luminous in Baikal's filtered light, making them visible even as they retreated into deeper water. These observations, brief as they were, became fixed in memory. A fragment of clarity before the chaos of emergency ascents. The reports did not stop there. In the following years, Soviet units and local fishermen noted strange underwater lights. Spheres of illumination rose from the depths, hovered beneath the ice, and vanished again. Patrols recorded sonar contacts too large and steady to be schools of fish. Yet impossible to track for long. At least one naval patrol boat logged an incident where its sonar operator tracked a solid contact, the size of a small submarine. The object held steady at depth, then rose rapidly before disappearing off the scope. The crew reported no accompanying surface disturbance. To them, it suggested something operating outside the performance of any known vehicle. The diver incident combined with the later accounts gave Baikal a reputation inside Soviet files as a place where unusual underwater phenomena appeared. No physical evidence was recovered. The descriptions remained in testimony only. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, fragments of these accounts circulated more widely. The essentials stayed the same: military divers, humanoid forms without gear, an attempt capture, and serious consequences. What makes the Baikal accounts stand apart is the overlap of sources. Divers, patrol crews, and local fishermen ... all describing unusual events within the same region and time frame. While not identical, the reports shared a pattern. Beings or objects moving with ease where human limits quickly collapse. The Lake Baikal case is notable because of who made the report. These were trained military personnel operating under controlled conditions. Their description of beings moving freely at great depths, immune to pressure and without breathing equipment, remains without explanation. In later years, sightings of luminous spheres and large sonar contacts continued to surface, but none matched the strangeness of the divers' direct encounter. Back in the Pacific, reports of the deep phenomena surfaced again. This time, it was not a military training exercise or a coastal hunt. But a working fleet at sea. San Juan Seamount Glow, 1995. Pacific, in 1995, commercial tuna boats operating near the San Juan Seamount, roughly 150 miles west of California, described a night that broke the pattern of their routine in a way that remained fixed in memory. The San Juan Seamount is a broad undersea mountain, its summit still far below the surface, but shallow enough to attract fish in large numbers. Tuna fleets worked the area for days at a time, setting nets and long lines across the currents. The nights were long but familiar, with deck lights burning, nets being hauled, and crews resting in shifts. On one of those nights, multiple vessels reported seeing the ocean itself change. Crews described the water as suddenly illuminated from below, not the way phosphorescence glows when disturbed, but a wide, even radiance, as if a sheet of light had been switched on beneath the surface. Asterisk, one captain said, the glow was so strong that the hull of his vessel cast a shadow upward, the way it would under daylight. The glow was not stationary. According to the fishermen, the light moved in broad, sweeping patterns beneath the fleet, changing from pale white to amber and back again. The impression was of something vast. Not a single point, but a source that seemed larger than any vessel present. Crews compared it to looking down into a swimming pool at night, with floodlights shining from beneath. Only here the pool was the Pacific. And the lights stretched across hundreds of meters. Several boats altered course, either to avoid or to follow the glow. Men leaned over the rails, watching as the surface water shifted. Ripples formed even where no boat was moving, spreading outward in circles that suggested an object turning beneath. Nets lowered into the area returned empty, but several crews reported their gear being tugged or fouled, as if it had snagged against something solid moving below. Word carried across the fleet by radio. At least half a dozen boats reported the phenomenon that night, logging times and positions. Some described seeing the light rise closer to the surface, bright enough to show the outlines of fish scattering above it. Others said the illumination stretched along the length of the seamount ridge, as though a source were traveling its crest. When the light moved away, several crews gave chase, following with their engines while watching the glow fade into deeper water. Each time the radiance diminished gradually until it vanished, leaving the surface dark again. Hours later, it appeared in another sector. Again, beneath the working fleet, the reports reached shore quickly. The tuna fleet was accustomed to long, difficult trips, but crews also knew the value of logging unusual events. Several captains filed reports, not only with their companies, but also with the Coast Guard, noting the incident for safety reasons. The concern was simple. If a submarine or large vessel had been operating that close to their nets, the risk of collision or entanglement was real. Coast Guard review teams logged the positions and confirmed that no U.S. Navy exercise had been scheduled in that region at the time. A few weeks later, patrol craft operating out of California ports reported seeing unusual surface ripples in the same area, though without the luminous displays noted by the fishermen. Nothing further was added to the official record. What makes the San Juan Seamount case notable is the scale of the observation. This was not a single witness at sea... but multiple crews aboard working vessels... Men who knew the water and the behavior of light on its surface. Their descriptions were consistent. A massive glow moving beneath the fleet, large enough to turn the Pacific into what one captain called a glass floor lit from below. No physical trace was left, and no conclusive explanation followed. Some of the men suggested it might have been a military craft using high-powered lights. Others dismissed that idea, pointing out that the illumination was far larger and steadier than anything they had ever seen, and that the Navy had denied operating in the area. In the end, the matter remained unresolved. For those who were there, the night stood apart from all others. Amid the routine of fishing, the seamount became the stage for something that revealed itself only in light, vast and silent beneath the surface. It was never caught, never identified, but it was witnessed by dozens of men at sea who agreed on one thing. Whatever passed beneath their boats that night was not like anything they had seen before. Back in the Caribbean, the pattern of lights beneath the sea did not fade. Puerto Rico fishermen and logs, after the tuna fleets off California, reported vast sheets of illumination. Smaller boats working the waters near Puerto Rico gave their own accounts. These were not large commercial vessels, but fishermen in modest craft, operating close to shore, who found themselves tracked by something moving with them in the dark. They described nights when the sea suddenly brightened below, not with scattered bioluminescence, but with a single focused glow. The light did not stay still. It shifted course, rising and falling, sometimes circling their boats. One crew reported it pacing them for nearly half an hour, sliding silently beneath the hull before darting ahead. Fishermen later described a sensation not only as light, but as force. As the luminous object paced their boats, they felt shifts in the water itself, sudden surges and slackening pressure that moved the hulls without any visible wake. Nets were tugged sharply, as if caught by currents too fast to follow, forcing some crews to cut their gear free. The effect was described as being pushed and pulled by something vast beneath them... moving with deliberate changes in speed and direction. Word of these encounters reached authorities. At least one group of fishermen contacted the Coast Guard, reporting what they called an unidentified underwater illumination that had followed them offshore. Log entries from Coast Guard stations note the call and describe the reported behavior. A steady glow beneath the surface, no identifiable vessel, and no surface disturbance to suggest propellers. The notation records that patrol response was not possible at the time. These observations were not isolated. Over the following months, fishermen continued to describe bright maneuvering lights that disturbed fish and fouled nets. The Coast Guard maintained a set of incident logs... noting dates, positions, and basic descriptions. None were classified as threats, but several entries stressed that no U.S. Navy submarines were operating in the area at the times reported. What makes the Puerto Rico accounts notable is the overlap of testimony. Civilian fishermen accustomed to the sea and to natural luminescence described lights that behaved like solid maneuvering objects. Coast Guard patrols working independently logged similar details. Mobile beams, fast sonar contacts, and the impression of something large and directed beneath the surface. No retrieval was made, and no official explanation followed. The case remained a sequence of logged sightings that pointed to the same theme. Beneath the Caribbean, just as in northern seas and the Pacific, there were moments when the water itself seemed to conceal objects moving with intent, glimpsed only as light and speed before vanishing again. As the century closed, sharper sensors and tighter reporting ensured that when contacts appeared, they no longer stayed as stories. They became operations. Navy reports. By the late 20th century, stories gave way to records. What had once been memories and logbooks now appeared on sonar screens and in Navy files. One of the first and most striking came in 1963 during anti-submarine exercises off Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico Deep Sonar Mystery 1963. The U.S. Navy carrier USS Wasp and its escorts were working a training area roughly 75 miles north of Puerto Rico. The Cold War was at its height, and anti-submarine warfare was a priority. Carrier groups drilled to detect, track, and neutralize hostile subs in the deep Caribbean basin, with the seafloor plunges to extraordinary depths. This time, however, the target was something the Navy had not expected. Reports described the contact as appearing suddenly on sonar during coordinated maneuvers. It did not behave like a known submarine. Instead, it registered speeds far beyond what any hull of that era could achieve. At times, the object was tracked moving at over 150 knots underwater, a figure more than 3 times faster than the best nuclear submarines then in service. Just as notable was the depth. Operators recorded returns at 27,000 feet below the surface, a zone far beyond the crush depth of even the most advanced submarines. For days, ships in the group tracked the contact. Crews rotated. Logs were updated, and sonar screens kept marking the same anomaly. An object moving with apparent control, changing course and speed with precision. Attempts to classify the target yielded nothing that fit naval inventories. No submarine, friendly or hostile, was rated for those depths or velocities. The behavior was consistent enough to form a picture. Sonar operators reported rapid accelerations and sudden decelerations, movements that would have destroyed known craft under the stresses of underwater drag. Yet the signal held steady, as if the contact were unaffected by the medium it moved through. At times, the object seemed to pace the exercise group. At others, it broke away and reappeared at distances no ordinary submarine could have crossed in the time given. Procedure required that anomalous contacts be logged and reported through command channels. The 1963 Puerto Rico case left a trail of records. Training logs, after-action reports, and later fragments that surfaced in declassified files. The data never pointed to a definitive explanation, but the numbers remained on paper, resistant to dismissal. Depths approaching 27,000 feet and sustained speeds of 150 knots or more left little room for interpretation. Either the records were in error, or the Navy had tracked something that exceeded known technology. Beyond the raw data, the persistence of the contact left an impression on those who worked the sonar screens. Men recalled how their equipment tracked the object as if it were a perfectly stable machine, yet one free of physical limits. The strain of maintaining vigilance over several days etched the anomaly deeper into memory. Each watch officer understood the importance of accuracy. Mistakes in sonar reporting could mean the difference between a real submarine threat and a phantom. Yet no correction or retraction was ever filed. The readings stood as they had been first reported. The case gained attention years later when declassified fragments confirmed that the Navy had indeed logged the contact. The reports did not assign a conclusion. Instead, they emphasized the performance as beyond known capability. That phrasing, deliberately restrained yet firm, highlighted the problem. There was no known naval inventory, American or Soviet, that could dive to 27,000 feet and move at aircraft speeds. Underwater, the Puerto Rico operation is significant because of its duration and scale. Unlike fleeting sightings, this was a sustained event monitored continuously during a major exercise. It was not a lone fisherman's impression or a single captain's night watch. It was an entire task group armed with Cold War sonar and under pressure to identify any potential threat. In that context, the anomaly took on weight. It was logged ... analyzed ... and preserved because it defied the limits of the known. What the Navy tracked remains an open question. Some researchers frame it as an early example of what is now called transmedium behavior, the ability to operate seamlessly between air and water without regard to drag, pressure, or structural stress. The records themselves, however, are blunt. They list speed. They list depth. They note that no submarine of the time, or since, has matched those figures. In the decades since, the Puerto Rico case has been revisited in light of later reports. The combination of extreme depth and extreme speed reappears across Navy files and in accounts from other nations. Each time, the data presses the same question. If the numbers are correct, what kind of vehicle was being tracked? No resolution followed the 1963 exercise. The contact disappeared as suddenly as it appeared, leaving the ships to resume their drills. But in the record, the anomaly stayed. For the men who logged it, the episode was a reminder that the sea, even when charted, patrolled, and scanned with the most advanced tools of the era, could still return signals that had no place in the catalog. For investigators who came later, the Puerto Rico operation stood as a marker. It was not a story retold from memory. It was a Navy record written in the cautious language of officers who dealt in precision. And what they recorded was an object that moved through the Korean depths with speed and endurance no known craft could match. 15 years later, the ocean would answer differently. Not with a trace on sonar, but with damage no one could easily explain. USS Stein sonar damage, 1978. Pacific. In early 1978, the U.S. Navy Knox-class frigate USS Stein, FF-1065, returned to port with damage unlike anything seen before in peacetime service. The frigate had been conducting routine operations in the Pacific. Working with the Navy's powerful new sonar systems designed to detect submarines at long range. These domes, fitted to the underside of ships. Housed sensitive acoustic equipment and were built to withstand enormous stress. They were shielded. Streamlined. And tested against the hazards of the open sea. But when Stein pulled into dry dock, engineers saw that something had torn the sonar dome apart. The dome itself was covered in gouges and scratches, as though a set of claws or blades had raked across it. More than half of the protective coating had been stripped away. In places, entire sections of the fiberglass covering were shredded. This was not the result of impact with debris or collision with another vessel. The damage had an organic quality, as though some living force had tried to rend the dome open. When fragments of the torn material were examined, investigators made a discovery that only deepened the mystery. Embedded in the shredded fiberglass were remains that appeared biological in nature. Small hooks and barbs similar to the chitinous claws of a deep-sea creature. They were unlike the barnacles or mollusks that sometimes attach themselves to ship hulls. Instead, these were sharp ... curved ... and strong enough to gouge a surface designed to resist tremendous ocean pressures. Navy engineers were left with a puzzle. No known marine life matched the size implied by the damage. Squid and octopus were considered, but the scale of the markings far exceeded what even the largest giant squid could produce. The sonar dome was massive, and the gouges stretched across it in sweeping arcs. To inflict that kind of damage, whatever creature or object had made contact would have needed both great size and immense strength. The official repair logs noted the incident, recording the condition of the dome and the unusual biological traces. But no conclusion was filed. The Navy did not issue a public statement, nor did it claim to have identified the source. Instead, the USS Stein was quietly repaired, its sonar dome rebuilt ... and the ship returned to service. For those who later studied the case, the Stein incident stood out because it left physical evidence. Unlike sonar contacts or radar tracks, the damage to the dome could be touched and photographed. Technicians working the repairs saw it directly. They described long tears resembling claw marks, accompanied by remnants that seemed alien to any familiar ocean species. Some researchers pointed to the case as an indirect example of unidentified submerged objects, USOs, interacting with naval hardware. While previous accounts involved sonar anomalies or radar returns, here the evidence was material. Something had not only been present, but had come into physical contact with a Navy ship violently enough to disable part of its most sensitive equipment. The USS Stein case was quietly filed away, yet it continued to circulate among naval circles and later UFO investigators. The combination of shredded fiberglass, embedded organic remains, and the sheer scale of the incident placed it in a rare category. It was not an anecdote from sailors or a log entry of strange speeds. It was torn equipment hauled into dry dock, examined by engineers, and noted in official maintenance reports. In retrospect, the 1978 Stein damage fits a larger pattern. Across the decades, naval forces have encountered objects, sometimes visual, sometimes acoustic, and sometimes physical, that defy ordinary classification. What made the Stein remarkable was its tangibility. Unlike fleeting tracks, it could not be dismissed as a false reading or atmospheric quirk. The dome was torn ... and the hooks lodged in it were real. The case remains unresolved. No marine biologist has identified a creature capable of producing the scale of damage recorded. No naval engineer has offered a conventional explanation that fits both the markings and the embedded material. What happened beneath the waves in 1978 ... remains a mystery for the Navy. The tracks remained unresolved. Another unsolved entry in the log. They hinted at an object able to cross boundaries between mediums, slipping from sea to sky in ways no vessel was built to match. That hint would not fade. In the decade that followed, aviators would see it with their own eyes. USS Nimitz Tic Tac UFO, 2004, California. Off the coast of California in November 2004, the U.S. Navy carrier USS Nimitz and its strike group were running routine exercises when their radar screens began showing contacts that should not have been there. For several days, the cruiser USS Princeton tracked objects at extreme altitudes, 60,000 feet, dropping suddenly to near sea level, hovering, and then climbing back into the sky. These movements did not match any known aircraft or missile profile. The operators on Princeton were accustomed to clutter ... glitches ... and false returns. But the contacts did not behave like noise. They held to coherent paths, appeared in consistent locations ... and repeated their movements over multiple days. This ruled out chance or equipment error. For the Navy, the objects demanded attention. The Pacific was busy with test flights, commercial traffic, and foreign surveillance. But nothing in known inventories could account for the maneuvers being logged. On the 14th, fighters were launched to investigate. Commander David Fravor and his wingmen, flying FA-18 Super Hornets, were directed toward one of the descending objects. What they found was not another aircraft, but a disturbance in the ocean below ... as though something large was submerged just beneath the surface. Above that patch of water hovered a white oblong craft ... smooth and featureless. It was about the size of a fighter jet, but had no wings, no exhaust, and no visible means of flight. The scene was striking for its clarity. The sky was clear, visibility was excellent, and both pilots could observe the object without interference. Fravor described its motion as playful but decisive, as if it were aware of their presence and responding directly to it. Unlike conventional intercepts, where geometry and thrust determined who gained position, the Tic-Tac operated outside the rules. It ignored the physics that govern jet combat. Fravor banked toward it. The object reacted immediately, turning to face his jet. Each time he tried to close distance, it mirrored his movements, then darted away with acceleration beyond anything his aircraft could match. In an instant, it disappeared, only to reappear on radar 60 miles away at the precise rendezvous point where the strike group's fighters had been ordered to regroup. It had traveled the distance in seconds. Back aboard the ships, radar operators watched in disbelief. The systems that had tracked bombers, cruise missiles, and satellites for years were now marking a target that leaped across distances no propulsion could explain. The contact was not sporadic. It was repeatable ... traceable ... and synchronized with the flight paths of the Navy's own aircraft. That made it impossible to ignore. Follow-on flights recorded the objects on targeting pods. The infrared footage, later known as FLIR1... gimbal, and Go Fast ... showed the same smooth, wingless forms, rotating, hovering, and accelerating at impossible speeds. Pilots struggled to lock weapon systems onto the targets. The objects had no heat signature consistent with engines, yet they maneuvered effortlessly against strong winds. For the aviators, the sensor data confirmed what their eyes had already seen. The Tic-Tac had no tail, no rotor, no intake ... no wings, and no plume. It flew with none of the scars of propulsion that every aircraft leaves behind. Instead, it slipped through the sky as though inertia and drag were irrelevant. What set the Nimitz encounter apart was not just pilot testimony, but the layered record. Radar operators on Princeton had tracked the contacts for days. Visual observers confirmed them in flight, and advanced sensor pods captured them on tape. This was not a fleeting anomaly ... but a coordinated observation across multiple Navy platforms. The Navy had seen anomalies before. Strange blips, unexplained lights, pilot reports that lingered only in memory. But here, the chain of evidence was multi-domain. The radar gave speed and altitude. The pilots gave sight and description. The pods gave imagery that could be replayed ... slowed ... and analyzed. Each piece reinforced the others, building a case that could not be waved away as misperception. Logs and data were collected. As in earlier decades, the material was sent up the chain of command. But this time, fragments eventually leaked beyond classified channels. When the footage was released years later and acknowledged as genuine by the Pentagon, the case became a modern touchstone. The performance described remained unexplainable. The Tic-Tac had descended tens of thousands of feet in seconds, hovered motionless, paced supersonic fighters, and anticipated their movements. Its accelerations defied aerodynamic limits. Its stability suggested a kind of flight not bound by ordinary drag or inertia. No American or foreign inventory matched the profile. This raised quiet but significant implications. If the data were accurate, then the Navy had encountered a craft that outclassed its own strike fighters in every measurable way. Speed, agility, endurance. If the data were flawed, then the failure was just as serious. It would mean multiple independent systems across air and sea had simultaneously malfunctioned in a way that produced the same false picture. Either outcome unsettled those charged with defense. For the Navy, the event was preserved in restrained language, unidentified. Yet for the aviators and operators involved, it stood as the most extraordinary contact of their careers. The data did not describe rumor or speculation. It described a craft that moved through secure American airspace with abilities no known technology possessed. The Nimitz strike group tracked remains unresolved. Some frame it as the clearest case of transmedium capability. The suggestion that the same objects seen above the ocean might also move within it. Others caution that the event demonstrates something simpler, that even the most advanced defense systems can still be confronted by the unknown. The case endures because it was more than a story. It left behind tapes, radar tracks, and testimony that converged. For the Navy, it was another entry in a long file of anomalies. For the public, it was a moment when the curtain lifted, however briefly, to show that the limits of flight, and perhaps of the sea below, may not yet be the limits at all. Soon, attention turned from what the sky revealed to what the sea concealed. East Coast Fast Movers, 2019. Atlantic. In 2019, crews aboard U.S. Navy vessels off the East Coast began reporting a kind of sonar contact that carried its own label. Fast Movers. The name was informal, coined by operators in the sonar rooms, but it reflected a pattern they could not ignore. These were not faint blips or questionable returns. The objects appeared suddenly, locked in on multiple screens, and showed speeds that exceeded anything in the Navy's undersea catalog. Sonar traces showed what looked like solid contacts moving at hundreds of knots beneath the surface. For comparison, the fastest submarines in service rarely reached 40 knots. Even advanced torpedoes designed for speed over short distances did not approach the figures that sonar operators were logging. The tracks would appear, cut across the screen in seconds, and vanish as quickly as they came. What made the reports notable was not just the numbers, but their repetition. Crews aboard more than one vessel described the same thing. Different patrols, different nights, but always the same term circulating in conversations. Fast movers. In sonar rooms where discipline was routine and speculation discouraged, the phrase carried weight. It meant operators recognized a class of contact that resisted the ordinary categories, as with earlier eras. The Navy's procedures ensured the logs did not vanish into rumor. Records were entered, SYST EAMS checked, and reports moved up the chain. The official files did not call them fast movers, but the slang survived among the sailors because it was more descriptive than any formal designation. It was shorthand for an anomaly, a target that moved too quickly to be a submarine ... and too steadily to be dismissed as clutter. Fragments of these reports would only surface later, in the slow trickle of documents released under the Freedom of Information Act. The language in those papers was cautious. As always, entries referred to anomalous sonar contacts, unresolved tracks, or unexplained high-speed returns. Yet, the sailors' phrase filtered through. Fast movers became known outside the fleet, a rare glimpse into the vocabulary used by crews when the official terms fell short. The FOIA material was sparse. But what it revealed mattered. It showed that the events were not singular, not confined to one vessel or one night. Instead, they were recurring enough that the phrase carried from ship to ship across different deployments. Each file was thin on detail ... But together they formed a thread. Evidence that the Navy was still encountering the same kind of puzzle logged in decades past. For the operators, the tracks were always fleeting. They could not be pursued or classified before they were gone. No wreckage followed. No known submarine was ever intercepted at those speeds. The contacts left nothing but their trace across the screens, and the puzzled notes of those who watched them vanish. The importance of the 2019 fast mover reports lay in their timing. By that decade, the Navy's sonar systems were far more advanced than those of the Cold War era. Sensitivity ... fidelity ... and calibration had improved to the point where false readings were less common, not more. And yet, even with cutting-edge arrays, operators were still watching returns that behaved in ways no technology was supposed to. For investigators, that sharpened the problem. If advanced equipment was still logging speeds far beyond submarines, then dismissing the contacts as error became harder. Either the sensors were malfunctioning across multiple ships in similar ways, or there was something real under the water. Moving faster than naval doctrine allowed, the East Coast sightings remained unresolved. They were brief ... elusive, and impossible to tie to any confirmed vehicle. But in the quiet of sonar rooms, they stood as a reminder. Even in an age of precision sensors and constant surveillance, the ocean still returned signals that resisted classification. The sailors called them fast movers because that was the only description that fit. In the official files, they were left at that. Anomalous, unexplained, and marked down only as another entry in the Navy's long record of contacts that moved too fast to belong to anything known. With reports stretching from radar rooms to sonar screens. The Navy was left with traces that refused ordinary classification. The question that remained was not whether the contacts existed, but how they could move as they did. Theories followed. Theories on USO's one of the most persistent ideas attached to USO. Reports is that the objects are not just passing through the oceans ... but using them as home. The logic is simple. The sea covers most of the planet. It shields activity from casual observation, and its acoustic properties can mask movements from sonar in ways land and air cannot. Where the sky is open to satellites, the ocean's depths remain far harder to surveil. The hypothesis places hidden sites in the places humans rarely go. The trench systems of the Pacific ... the ridges of the Atlantic ... the caves along rugged coasts, and under the ice caps. The Mariana Trench, with depths greater than Everest's height, has long been suggested as an obvious location. In the north, the Norwegian Trench and Arctic seabed corridors have generated similar speculation after repeated contacts logged in the Cold War era. Even the deep Caribbean ... where clusters of sightings have been recorded from Puerto Rico through the Bahamas ... is named as a candidate ... in each case. The geography offers concealment, and repeated accounts of lights rising or vanishing near. These same regions fuel the idea further. Some of the strongest fuel for the theory comes from under-ice anomalies. During both US and Soviet patrols, sonar operators reported returns that seemed to travel beneath the polar caps, moving with speeds no submarine could achieve. If the objects could transition between sea and air, as the Nimitz and later encounters suggest, then basing beneath ice would offer both cover and access to multiple theaters, literal caves. Along volcanic islands or continental shelves are another option, especially in areas where fishing crews have described objects. slipping into cliffside waters with no sign of emergence. But all of this remains circumstantial. No survey has uncovered the infrastructure of a base. No probe has filmed hangar-like structures at depth. What exists are patterns, clusters of reports near trenches ... anomalies beneath ice ... and sonar tracks in the same corridors across decades. For advocates, the patterns suggest more than coincidence. For cautious analysts, they mark zones where ocean currents, acoustics, and human observation overlap to create fertile ground for interpretation. The hidden base theory survives because it aligns with the data. Objects appear ... vanish ... and sometimes reappear in corridors that would make sense for concealment. Yet without physical proof, it remains conditional. A reminder of how much of the ocean is still unobserved, and how easily it could hide what surface eyes cannot. And if the oceans themselves conceal nothing more than corridors, the burden shifts to the craft. The repeated accounts of sudden ascents, abrupt stops, and seamless transitions between sea and air suggest not only hidden places of origin ... but machines designed to treat the boundary between water and sky as irrelevant. From that perspective, the focus moves naturally from bases to the vehicles themselves. If hidden bases explain where unidentified objects might reside, transmedium propulsion addresses how they move. The term implies more than speed. It suggests mastery of the boundary itself. To shift from water to air without pause ... requires control over two very different fluids. One dense and resistant, the other thin and turbulent ... Yet reports describe craft that cross this interface seamlessly, with no turbulence ... splash ... or shockwave ... Traditional submarines are shaped to minimize drag underwater, while aircraft are shaped to manage airflow. These designs are mutually exclusive. Yet the so-called transmedium craft appear to ignore such constraints. They show no control surfaces, no propellers, no exhaust. Reports of underwater velocities exceeding 150 knots, sudden right-angle turns, and instantaneous ascents from depth into open air are consistent with performance beyond hydrodynamic or aerodynamic limits. The numbers matter because they break models. Even experimental torpedoes that use supercavitation, forming bubbles around their hulls, are unstable at high speed and lack maneuverability. By contrast, USO accounts describe objects that not only outrun the fastest submarines, but also pivot, hover, and climb at will. Grounded explanations remain speculative. Some engineers speak of field effects that could reduce drag by altering fluid density around a craft, or of coupling mechanisms that control pressure gradients at the surface boundary. But these remain ideas, not claims. What persists is the pattern. Observations across decades that suggest vehicles treating sea and sky as a single continuous medium. If transmedium propulsion suggests technology beyond current engineering, the natural counterpoint is to look inward. Could these craft belong to us? Military history is filled with projects kept classified for decades. From stealth aircraft to undersea drones, what is experimental today can be operational tomorrow, often without the public knowing until long after. For some, the simplest explanation is not visitors or unknown physics, but hidden programs operating under deep secrecy. The timeline invites the question. Many USO encounters coincide with periods of heavy naval testing. The Cold War produced fleets of submarines and surveillance systems few outside military circles knew existed. Even today, the Pentagon acknowledges that hypersonic programs ... drone swarms, and undersea prototypes are pursued under classification. The possibility remains that what sailors and aviators describe are glimpses of platforms not meant to be seen. But the performance gap complicates the claim. Speeds logged underwater far outpace known submarines. Right-angle maneuvers at those velocities are not just difficult, but destructive under the laws of physics as applied to conventional hulls. Aircraft transitioning from sea to air without structural compromise would require breakthroughs no leaked program has ever hinted at. Still, secrecy works precisely because capabilities remain unknown. Advocates of the classified technology theory argue that if any nation had achieved such propulsion, it would be hidden as carefully as nuclear weapons once were. Whether these craft are foreign or domestic, the possibility that they are human remains a question intelligence services cannot dismiss. If some argue that the anomalies are products of hidden technology, others step back further and suggest no technology at all is required. Before classified craft or transmedium vehicles, there is always the possibility that the ocean and atmosphere themselves are playing tricks. Not every anomalous return or unusual light needs an exotic explanation. The ocean is full of effects that can deceive even trained operators. Sonar ... in particular, is vulnerable to layers of temperature and salinity, which bend and refract sound, producing ghost contacts that seem to move faster or farther than they are. A school of fish can appear as a solid mass. A submarine wake can linger as a false track. Bioluminescence triggered by turbulence can light patches of sea in ways that suggest propulsion. For a watchstander in low light, the impression can be striking. Thermal layers are another culprit. When sound travels through water of different densities, it can create the illusion of high speed or sudden jumps in depth. Operators have long known of false targets caused by these shifts. Even on radar, atmospheric ducts can carry signals far beyond line of sight, allowing distant aircraft or ships to appear as if they are in impossible positions. These natural explanations appeal because they require nothing more than the environment already present. They remind us that oceans and skies are complex theaters where perception often outruns certainty. Yet the weakness of this theory is that it explains only the edges of the record. Nature confuses, but it rarely imitates with such precision. Having explored the theories, the question turns back to the larger picture. What the oceans may still be hiding ... and what the encounters ultimately leave unresolved. Conclusion across the reports, one pattern repeats. Objects appear where they should not, vanish into the depths ... and sometimes return as if nothing can hold them back. Radar tracks, pilot testimony, sonar echoes, all point to the same puzzle, yet none offer the answer. So we are left to ask, are these things truly moving through our seas ... or only shadows of something we cannot yet explain? The ocean holds the advantage. It covers most of our world, hiding more than it reveals. Its trenches drop deeper than our machines can follow. Its ice conceals corridors untouched by light, and its silence masks whatever may pass below. What has been seen may be only a glimpse, a ripple on the surface of something larger. Until more is known, the sea remains both shield and stage. Mysteries move unseen. Truth waits in the dark water, and the ocean ... as always, keeps its secrets. Outro. Thank you for drifting with us into the deep. The oceans hide what the skies reveal. UFOs above, UFOs below. Are they connected? Or are we only glimpsing part of something larger? Share your thoughts in the comments. We always love to read them. If you'd like more quiet journeys into the unknown, don't forget to like and subscribe so the next story finds you in the stillness of night. Until then, rest gently, drift deeper,